The tracers show up first, red streaks across the desert night arcing down from 3,000 feet. So many they stop looking like individual rounds. They blur into a single glowing cord, a serpent's tail whipping from heaven to earth. The sound hits a moment later. Not the snap of rifle fire, not the rhythmic punch of a .50 caliber. This is something else entirely. This is a circular saw chewing through sheet metal. A sustained, furious roar that refuses to die. 6,000 rounds per minute. 100 bullets every second. And somewhere below in the Nevada darkness, the desert floor erupts into dust and shattered rock, as if God himself has dragged a fingernail across the earth. The men watching from the observation bunker don't speak. They don't move. A colonel with 30 years of combat experience has his mouth slightly open, his cigar forgotten between two fingers, the ash growing long and curling. The woman standing beside him has her arms crossed. She's not watching the desert floor. She's watching the faces of the men who told her this would never work. Her name is Captain Diane Mercer. She is 28 years old, and the weapon ripping the Nevada night apart exists because the United States Pentagon told her no 3 times and she refused to hear it. But that moment, that vindication, is still a long way off. To understand why the M134 minigun had to exist, you first have to understand what it was built to protect. And what it was built to protect was the most revolutionary and most vulnerable machine the American military had ever sent into battle: the helicopter. By the late 1950s, the United States military was placing an enormous bet on a single tactical concept: air mobility. The idea was elegant in theory. Forget roads, forget armor columns grinding through terrain where every bridge is a bottleneck and every tree line is a kill zone. Instead, lift your soldiers over all of it. Drop them directly onto the objective. Extract them when the job is done. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois made it possible. The Huey, that distinct whop-whop-whop of the twin-blade rotor, became the heartbeat of a new doctrine. Fast insertion, rapid extraction. The ability to place a squad of riflemen on a ridgeline in a clearing behind enemy lines anywhere the rotors could find enough air to bite. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a death sentence. Because the helicopter, for all its versatility, has a fundamental design flaw that no amount of engineering has ever solved. It is at its core a thin-skinned aluminum box suspended in the air by a mechanical system that tolerates almost no damage. A single rifle round through the tail rotor drive shaft. A lucky burst into the turbine intake. One tracer igniting the fuel cell that sits beneath the passenger compartment like a bomb waiting for permission. And there is a window. Every pilot knows it. Every crew chief has felt it in the base of his spine. The deadly 11 minutes. 11 minutes of approach and liftoff, where the aircraft is low, slow, and completely exposed. The helicopter cannot evade during approach. It cannot accelerate out of danger during the final descent. It must commit to a landing zone, flare its nose upward, bleed off airspeed, and settle into a hover just above the ground. During those seconds, it is the largest, slowest, most obvious target on the battlefield. The opposition figured this out almost immediately during training exercises. The simulated enemy forces, the OP-4 units tasked with playing the adversary in war games, developed a brutally efficient method. Let the Americans call for helicopters, track the radio traffic, identify the landing zone, hold fire until the Huey drops below 50 feet and begins its flare. Then hit it with everything at once. Coordinated volleys from 3 edges of the clearing. Rifles, machine guns, every barrel aimed at the same piece of sky. A helicopter catching rounds on approach has exactly 2 options. Pull off, abort the landing, claw for altitude, and get out. The mission dies. The men on the ground stay trapped. Or commit. Push through the fire. Put the skids on the dirt. Pray the engines hold long enough to get back up again. The loss rates in advanced combat simulations were staggering. Classified reports circulated through the Pentagon with numbers that made generals lose sleep. The helicopter was supposed to be the future of American warfare. Instead, It was becoming a flying coffin, and the door gunners were the ones watching the lid close. Those door gunners carried M60 machine guns. Decent weapons, dependable. The M60 was a workhorse. Belt-fed, air-cooled 550 rounds per minute. A trained gunner could walk his tracers into a target and keep heads down long enough for the Huey to complete its landing. But an M60 cannot silence a full tree line. It cannot suppress three separate firing positions simultaneously. It cannot force a disciplined enemy to stop shooting simply from the sound of the barrels warming up. A door gunner behind an M60 could hit what he spotted. He could not make the battlefield shut up. Some units tried the M2 Browning, the 50 caliber. More punch, greater range. Rounds that could chew through light cover and keep traveling. But the M2 weighed 84 pounds without the tripod, barely cycled faster than the M60 and mounted awkwardly on most helicopter configurations. The extra weight cut into fuel reserves and troop capacity, and both weapons shared the same critical flaw. Gas-operated. Every gas-operated firearm relies on the same basic principle. When a round fires, a portion of the expanding gas is channeled back into the action to cycle the bolt, eject the spent casing, and chamber the next round. It is a system that works beautifully. Thousands of weapons across a century of warfare have proven its reliability until it doesn't. A dud cartridge. A round that fails to fire. In a gas-operated weapon, that single failure is catastrophic. No gas, no cycling. The action ceases. The gun is dead. And clearing a jam, working the charging handle, stripping the belt, finding the bad round, all while your helicopter is taking fire at 100 feet and the pilot is screaming for suppression, that is a very quick way to stop breathing. The army did not need a better machine gun. They needed a fire hose. And the woman who would give them one was at that moment standing in a museum, the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. A Tuesday afternoon in late 1957. Captain Diane Mercer had driven 40 minutes from the Pentagon, still wearing her service uniform, still carrying the folder with "rejected" stamped across its cover in red ink. Third time. The first rejection had been polite. "Interesting concept, Captain, not operationally viable at this time." The second had been dismissive. "We've reviewed your proposal. The committee does not see a path forward." The third had been personal. A two-star general whose name she would remember for the rest of her life leaned across the conference table and said with a smile that wasn't quite a smile that perhaps Captain Mercer's considerable talents might be better applied to logistics analysis. The men in the room had laughed, not all of them, but enough. She had gathered her papers without a word, walked out without saluting. Driven to the Smithsonian because she needed to stand in front of the thing that she knew with a certainty that bordered on fury could save lives. It sat behind glass in the American History Collection, a hand-cranked weapon with 6 rotating barrels mounted on a wheeled carriage, brass fittings dulled by age. The placard beside it read, "Gatling Gun Model 1862, patented by Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling." The idea behind it was elegant, simple in the way that only truly brilliant concepts manage to be. A single barrel firing continuously will overheat and warp. Distribute that heat across 6 barrels, each one firing only once per revolution, and the weapon can sustain fire far longer. The rotating barrels share the thermal load. The mechanical cycling eliminates the dependence on gas operation. Each barrel loads, fires, and ejects through pure mechanical sequence driven by the rotation itself. Dr. Gatling had envisioned it as a humanitarian instrument. He believed, with the optimism peculiar to 19th century inventors, that a weapon so devastating would make war too terrible to wage, that nations would simply stop fighting because the cost had become unthinkable. He was wrong about that. But he was right about the mechanism. The Gatling gun worked. It worked in the Civil War. It worked in the Indian Wars. It worked in Cuba and the Philippines. But by 1911, newer automatic weapons, the Maxim gun, the Browning designs, lighter, simpler. requiring no hand crank pushed the Gatling into obsolescence. The army declared it finished and shipped the surviving models to museums and armories, where they gathered dust for half a century. Diane Mercer stood in front of that glass case for 20 minutes. She was not a woman prone to dramatic gestures. She did not press her hand against the glass or whisper promises to a dead inventor. She simply stood there running calculations in her head that she had already run 100 times on paper. The math had never changed. The math was never the problem. The problem was that every general she briefed heard the same pitch and processed it through the same filter. A woman telling combat veterans how to fight. She left the museum, drove back to her office at Wright-Patterson, and began drafting a fourth proposal. This time she would not ask for permission. She would ask for a demonstration. The call came 3 weeks later. Not from the committee, not from the two-star general with the cutting smile, from a man she had never met. Colonel Raymond Beckett, 55 years old. Voice like gravel poured over iron. He had flown B-17s over Germany, survived 2 bailouts, transitioned to jets after the war, and now commanded an advanced weapons evaluation program that answered to people whose names did not appear on organizational charts. He called her on a Thursday evening. No pleasantries, no small talk. Captain Mercer, I've read your proposals, all 3 of them, and I've read the rejection memos. I want you to know something. I lost 14 flight crews last year in advanced combat exercises, simulated losses, training scenarios. If those had been real operations, that is 84 men who would be dead because the weapons on their helicopters could not keep the enemy's heads down for 11 minutes. You say you have a solution. I am giving you 6 months. Do not waste them. He hung up before she could respond. 6 months. A workspace at General Electric's Aerospace Division in Burlington, Vermont. A small team of engineers who looked at her with the same expression she had seen in every briefing room. Skepticism wrapped in courtesy until she started talking, and the courtesy fell away because the skepticism couldn't survive the math. The core concept was the Gatling mechanism, but not hand-cranked, not human-powered at all. An electric motor driving the barrel rotation at constant speed. Remove the hand crank and its human limitations, replace it with steady electrical power. And Dr. Gatling's 6-barrel design doesn't just work, it screams. The first prototype spun up on a bench test in March 1958. 4,000 rounds per minute. The engineers stood behind blast shields and watched the target wall disintegrate. Not punctured, not perforated, erased, but 4,000 rounds per minute from a 20mm cannon. The configuration that would become the M61 Vulcan for fighter jets was far too large for a helicopter. Too much recoil, too much weight, too much ammunition consumption. A helicopter carrying a Vulcan cannon would have room for the gun and nothing else. So they shrunk it, same principle, same 6-barrel rotation, same electric motor drive, but chambered in 7.62 NATO, the standard rifle cartridge of the Western Alliance. Smaller, lighter, and with the reduced caliber, the rate of fire climbed even higher. Variable rate 2,000 to 6,000 rounds per minute. At full speed, 100 rounds per second. They designated it the M134. The designation was bureaucratic, clinical. The weapon was anything but. Diane ran the numbers one final time before requesting the demonstration that would determine whether the M134 lived or died. Colonel Beckett arranged it. A formal evaluation before a Pentagon review panel. Senior officers, program managers, budget authorities. The men who controlled whether a weapon system received funding or got buried in a filing cabinet. She knew she would get one chance. The demonstration began conventionally. An M60 mounted on a test stand, a standard engagement, 550 rounds per minute. The target, a plywood and sandbag bunker at 200 meters, absorbed the rounds. Splinters flew, dust kicked up. Effective, professional, exactly what every man in that room expected from a machine gun. Then the M60 stopped. A single click. Silence. The action locked open. The belt hung limp. Diane had placed the dud round herself. Third cartridge in the second belt. She had crimped the primer with a pair of pliers the night before, ensuring it would never fire. A murmur went through the panel. A jam. Unfortunate but unsurprising. Gas-operated weapons jam. Everyone knew that. The armorer cleared the weapon in 9 seconds, a professional job, and the M60 resumed firing. But Diane had made her point without saying a word. 9 seconds, on a test range, in daylight, with no one shooting back. 9 seconds of silence while a helicopter hovers at 50 feet and the men inside it count heartbeats. Then the M134 spun up. The sound was immediate and absolute. Not individual shots, not a rhythm. A continuous tearing roar that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere deeper in the chest, in the jaw. The target bunker didn't absorb the rounds. It vanished. Plywood became splinters, became dust, became nothing. The sandbags burst open, and the sand itself was flung backward in a cloud that obscured the entire target area. 3 seconds. The gun fell silent. The desert hummed with the memory of the sound. And embedded in that 3-second burst in the fourth belt was another dud round. Same crimped primer. Same dead cartridge that would have killed an M60 stone dead. The M134 had not even hiccuped. The electric motor turned the barrels at constant speed regardless of what each individual cartridge did. When the firing pin struck the dead primer, and nothing happened, the mechanism simply continued. Its rotation extracted the unfired round, ejected it out. The side chambered the next live cartridge and kept firing. The gun never stopped. The gun could not stop. As long as the motor had power, the barrels would turn and anything fed into them would come out the other end. Dud round, the gun spits it out. Damaged casing, the gun spits it out. Corroded primer, the gun spits it out. It does not care. It does not wait. It does not jam. Colonel Beckett stood at the back of the observation area. He had not spoken during the entire demonstration. When the M134 fell silent and the panel members sat in their chairs processing what they had just witnessed, he caught Diane's eye across the bunker. He didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply looked at her with an expression she would later describe as the face of a man who has just watched someone prove that gravity works. The panel chairman, a brigadier general with a reputation for killing programs before they reached prototype, cleared his throat. Impressive, Captain. Genuinely impressive. A pause. But I need to see this weapon function on an actual aircraft, in field conditions, not on a test stand in controlled circumstances. You have shown me what it can do bolted to the ground. Show me what it can do bolted to something that flies. Diane did not blink. She had anticipated this. She had in fact been counting on it. Sir, I already have an airframe in mind. The aircraft she chose was a relic. A ghost from the previous war that had been sitting on the back lots of Air Force bases across the country, waiting to be scrapped. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a twin-engine cargo plane first flown in 1941. It had carried paratroopers to Normandy. It had dropped supplies over Bastogne. It had done its job with the quiet reliability of a machine built by people who understood that simplicity saves lives. By the late 1950s, nobody wanted it anymore. The jet age had arrived. Faster transports, bigger cargo bays, pressurized cabins. The C-47 was slow, unpressurized, unarmored, and profoundly unglamorous. Dozens of them sat on airfields across the American South and Southwest. Their paint fading, their tires slowly deflating, their service records gathering mold in filing cabinets. Diane Mercer looked at those abandoned aircraft and saw something no one else did. She saw a weapons platform. The concept was radical enough that even Beckett raised an eyebrow when she presented it. Cut firing ports into the left side of the fuselage. Mount 3 M134 miniguns pointing laterally. The pilot would fly a continuous left-hand banking turn, a pylon turn, maintaining a precise angle and airspeed that kept the left flank of the aircraft locked onto a single point on the ground. The airplane would not strafe. It would orbit, circling above a fixed position, pouring continuous fire into a defined area for as long as the ammunition held out. Not a diving attack run that lasted seconds, a sustained unbroken rain of lead that lasted minutes, hours if the supply held. Every tactician she briefed had the same first reaction. That is insane. Every tactician she briefed had the same second reaction, usually about 40 seconds later, after the geometry clicked in their heads. That might actually work. Beckett authorized the conversion of a single C-47 at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. 3 M134 miniguns. Ammunition storage, basic fire control. The maintenance crews called it a hack job. The pilots called it a flying junkyard. Diane called it spooky. The name stuck. And she needed a crew. Not just pilots, although finding men willing to fly a 20-year-old cargo plane loaded with miniguns and tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition in sustained banking turns over simulated combat zones required a specific breed of insanity. She needed gunners, men who would operate the M134 from inside the aircraft, managing the feed systems, monitoring the ammunition supply, keeping the weapons functioning in conditions of noise, vibration, and heat that no training manual had ever anticipated. Beckett found them. Young men mostly, the kind who volunteered for assignments that more sensible soldiers avoided. Among them was a 23-year-old sergeant from a cattle ranch outside Billings, Montana, a quiet kid with steady hands and an unsettling calmness under pressure that his instructors had noted from his first day in training. Sergeant Callum Briggs had never heard of a minigun, had never heard of a Gatling gun, had never heard of Captain Diane Mercer or Colonel Raymond Beckett, or any of the classified memoranda that had traveled back and forth across the Pentagon for the past 2 years. He had heard of helicopters getting shot down. He had heard of door gunners dying with jammed weapons in their hands. He had heard the stories that circulated through every enlisted barracks on every airbase in the country. The ones about the 11 minutes and the flying coffin, and the men who climbed aboard helicopters, knowing that the machine gun bolted to the doorframe might fail at the exact moment they needed it most. When they told him he would be operating a weapon that fired 100 rounds per second and could not jam, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked when he could start. The answer was immediately. Because out on the runway at Eglin, under the flat Florida sun, the ugliest airplane on the base was getting 3 new teeth. And Captain Diane Mercer was about to find out whether the dragon she had built on paper could breathe real fire. The first time Spooky flew with loaded guns, nobody on the ground slept. It was a night in December 1958. The Eglin test range stretched out below in moonless black sand and scrub and target arrays scattered across 3 square miles of controlled terrain. From the observation tower, a cluster of officers with binoculars and clipboards waited. Colonel Beckett stood among them, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. Diane Mercer was not in the tower. She had not asked permission. She had informed Beckett 48 hours before the flight that she would be aboard during the live-fire test, and Beckett had looked at her for 5 full seconds without blinking before he said, "If that airplane comes apart, I am not writing the letter to your family." "You won't have to," she said. "It's not going to come apart." She believed that. She had checked every weld, every mount, every ammunition feed path. She had calculated the stress loads on the fuselage, the vibration harmonics, the thermal expansion of the barrel assemblies. She had accounted for every variable her engineering training could identify. But training is theory, and theory ends the moment the trigger is pulled. The C-47 climbed to 3,000 feet and leveled off. Captain Everett Nash, 30 years old. A man who communicated primarily through single-syllable words and long silences, held the aircraft in a standard orbit, while the crew completed their pre-flight weapons checks. Callum Briggs was stationed at the forward minigun. Two other gunners manned the remaining positions. The ammunition containers were loaded. The feed belts were seated. The electric motors hummed at idle waiting. Diane stood between the gun positions braced against a fuselage rib, wearing a flight helmet 2 sizes too large and ear protection that she already suspected would not be enough. Nash's voice came through the intercom, flat, unhurried. "Turning inbound, target area in 60 seconds. Diane looked at Callum Briggs. The young sergeant from Montana had his hands on the weapon, his eyes on the night below. He did not look nervous. He did not look excited. He looked like a man waiting to do a job he had been trained for. And the simplicity of that expression steadied her more than any engineering calculation ever had. 30 seconds. Nash rolled the C-47 into a 30-degree left bank. The aircraft tilted, and the night sky swung sideways in the open gun ports. Diane grabbed the fuselage rib harder. The ground appeared below the left wing, dark and featureless. "On target! Weapons free!" Callum Briggs pulled the trigger. What followed was not a sound, but a physical event. A detonation of noise that bypassed the ears and struck the chest, the teeth, the bones of the skull. The M134 did not fire in the way Diane had heard weapons fire before. There were no individual reports, no rhythm, no gaps between rounds. The 6 barrels spun and the gun produced a single continuous roar so dense and so sustained that it stopped being sound and became pressure. The aircraft shuddered, not from recoil. The M134 produces remarkably little felt recoil for its output. The rotating barrels distribute the force across the entire cycle. The shudder was vibration harmonics traveling through the airframe as 3 weapons poured a combined 18,000 rounds per minute through the open ports and into the darkness below. Diane forced herself to look down through the nearest gun port. Every 5th round was a tracer. At 6,000 rounds per minute per gun, that meant 60 tracers per second from each weapon. They did not look like bullets. They did not arc or scatter. They formed 3 solid glowing red beams stretching from the aircraft to the earth, unwavering, continuous, as if someone had drawn lines of fire from heaven to ground with a burning stylus. The target area, a grid of old vehicles, sandbag emplacements, and plywood structures arranged to simulate a defensive position, did not resist. It disintegrated. Vehicles bounced on their frames as hundreds of rounds struck in the span of a single breath. Sandbags burst and their contents sprayed outward in fans of dust. Plywood didn't splinter. It vaporized. The firing lasted 12 seconds. When the guns fell silent, Diane Mercer was gripping the fuselage ribs so hard that her fingers had gone white. Her ears were ringing through the double layer of protection. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. She had spent 2 years designing this weapon. She had calculated its ballistic output, its rate of fire, its ammunition consumption per second, down to the individual cartridge. She knew what it could do. She had known on paper. She had not understood what it meant in the air, standing 6 feet away, feeling the airframe tremble with the sheer density of metal passing through it, watching the ground below churn as if the earth itself were boiling. Nash brought the aircraft out of its bank and climbed back to altitude. His voice came through the intercom unchanged. Same flat tone, same economy of words. "Target area neutralized, returning for assessment pass." They flew over the target grid at 500 feet on the return pass. Diane looked down. In the beam of the aircraft's searchlight, she could see the impact zone. Every structure was gone, not damaged. Gone. The vehicles had been shoved sideways off their positions by the sheer volume of impacts. The sandbag walls had been reduced to shallow craters. The ground itself was churned, pockmarked, savaged. Callum Briggs was reloading the forward gun. His hands moved with mechanical precision, seating a fresh ammunition belt, checking the feed path, cycling the motor briefly to confirm function. He caught Diane watching him and offered a small nod, nothing more. She nodded back. When the aircraft landed, Beckett was waiting on the tarmac. He had watched the entire sequence through stabilized binoculars from the tower. He walked to Diane as she climbed down the crew ladder. His expression had shifted from the careful blankness he usually wore to something she had never seen on his face before. "It works," he said. "It works," she confirmed. He said nothing else for a moment. Then quietly, "God help whoever is on the receiving end of that." Over the following months, Spooky and its crew ran exercise after exercise. Night operations, close support simulations, sustained fire missions. And each time the same pattern revealed itself. Nash would roll into his banking turn, calibrate his airspeed to hold the turn radius constant, and lock the left side of the aircraft onto a fixed point on the ground. The gunners would fire. The aircraft would orbit. And for as long as the ammunition lasted, and the engines held, that fixed point ceased to exist as a viable position for anything living. It was during the fourth major exercise, a joint evaluation with Army ground forces, acting a simulated opposition, that something happened which none of the engineers, tacticians, or senior officers had predicted. Something that would reshape the entire program and change what Diane understood about the things she had built. The OP-4 unit's experienced soldiers tasked with testing the weapon system's limitations were positioned in prepared defensive works across a mock landing zone. Their objective was straightforward: engage the incoming helicopters with simulated fire, score hits, demonstrate the vulnerability of air assault operations. Spooky arrived overhead at 2 in the morning. Nash rolled into his bank. Callum Briggs opened fire. The OP-4 unit stopped fighting. Not gradually. Not after assessing the situation and making a tactical decision to withdraw. They stopped. Some of them physically pressed themselves into the ground. Others abandoned their positions and moved to the rear. 2 squad leaders later reported that their men refused direct orders to engage the aircraft. The exercise referees were baffled. These were trained soldiers, professionals, men who had performed capably against every other weapons system in the Army's inventory. They had engaged fighter jets. They had stood their ground against simulated artillery barrages. They had fought through smoke, noise, and confusion without breaking. But when the minigun spoke, they quit. The after-action reports tried to quantify it. Words like suppressive effect and psychological impact appeared in clinical paragraphs. Diane read those reports and recognized their inadequacy. The reports described behavior. They did not explain it. The explanation came from the OPFOR soldiers themselves. In debriefings, they struggled to articulate what they had experienced. The sound was part of it, but not all of it. Other weapons were loud. Artillery was louder. What made the minigun different was the continuity. There was no gap between rounds. No pause in which the brain could process, assess, and decide. The sound was a wall, solid and unbroken. And behind that wall was the knowledge that hundreds of projectiles per second were arriving in your position, and that no action you could take, no cover, you could find, no decision you could make would alter that fact for as long as the aircraft remained overhead. It was not the fear of being hit, it was the certainty of it. Within weeks, the OP-4 units had developed informal doctrines that no one had ordered them to create. Do not fire at the aircraft with the continuous sound. Do not reveal your position. When you hear it, go to ground and wait. They gave it a name. Not the M134, not the minigun, not even Spooky. They called it the Dragon, because at night, with the tracers pouring from the sky in an unbroken red stream, it looked exactly like a creature exhaling fire. The name spread through the base, through the command structure, through the maintenance crews and the mess halls and the barracks. Diane heard it for the first time from a motor pool sergeant who didn't know she had anything to do with the weapon. "You hear they brought the Dragon out again last night." She had designed a weapon. She had built a machine that solved a tactical problem with engineering precision. Feed mechanism, barrel rotation, and electric motor drive, ammunition management. Components, systems, numbers on paper that translated into metal and motion. She had not designed a dragon, but that is what she had made. And understanding what that meant, What it truly meant to create something that broke the will of trained soldiers through sheer psychological force was a different kind of knowledge than engineering had ever given her. The M134 did not merely suppress the enemy. It reached inside their heads and turned off the part that was willing to fight. She did not yet understand the full weight of that power. She would. The largest proof came during the most ambitious exercise the program had yet attempted. A full-scale simulated assault on a forward operating base, conducted over an entire night with regimental strength up for attacking in waves. Captain Everett Nash lifted Spooky off the runway at dusk. Callum Briggs and his crew had loaded every round the aircraft could carry. The base defense commander had been told that air support would be available. He had not been told what kind. The first assault wave hit the perimeter at 9 in the evening. Simulated mortar fire probing attacks, suppressive volleys. The base defenders returned fire. The exercise unfolded normally. Then, Nash brought Spooky overhead. He rolled into his banking turn at 2200 hours, and the miniguns opened up. The assault stalled immediately. Units that had been advancing undercover broke off and retreated. Positions that had been pouring fire into the base went silent. Nash held the orbit. Briggs managed the ammunition with the discipline that Diane had watched him develop over months of training. Short control bursts walking the tracers into target areas, conserving rounds for the long night ahead. When the supply ran low, Nash broke orbit, flew back to Eglin, landed, and the ground crew loaded fresh ammunition in under 20 minutes. Then Nash flew back and resumed the turn. He did this 3 times. By sunrise, the aircraft had expended 63,000 rounds. Laid end to end, those cartridges would stretch more than 3 miles. The logistics alone hauling that volume aboard, keeping the feed systems functioning through hours of continuous vibration and heat, deconflicting with friendly positions below to prevent fratricide, demanded an orchestration from the crew that bordered on artistry. The base held. Every assault wave had been broken. The OP-4 commander, a lieutenant colonel with 2 decades of infantry experience, submitted his after-action report with a single sentence underlined at the top. No position defended by this weapon system was penetrated during the exercise. That sentence traveled through channels. It was repeated in briefing rooms, in hallways, in late-night conversations between officers who had spent their careers studying the problem of keeping helicopters alive. It hardened from observation into conviction, and from conviction into something close to gospel. No base protected by the Dragon was ever overrun while the aircraft remained overhead. Whether that statement was literally true across every subsequent exercise is difficult to verify from the records. But it did not matter. Everyone believed it. The ground troops believed it. The air crews believed it. And the OP-4 believed it most of all. Diane was promoted. The M134 program received full production authorization. Spooky moved from prototype to operational deployment. Everything she had fought for across 3 rejections, across months of condescension and doubt, had been validated. Beckett took her aside the day the authorization came through. They stood on the flight line at Eglin watching a fresh C-47 receive its gun mounts. The Florida sun was flat and white, and the tarmac shimmered with heat. "You won," he said. His voice carried no triumph. "You were right about the weapon. You were right about the platform. You were right about all of it." A pause. "But you haven't paid the price yet. Every weapon has a cost, not the budget, not the production line. The cost that shows up later in ways you don't expect, carried by people who didn't choose to carry it." Diane said nothing. She did not yet understand what he meant. She would, because on a routine night training flight 6 weeks later, a Spooky crew designated Flight 71 climbed to altitude over the Gulf Coast, and everything that Beckett had warned her about arrived in the form of a magnesium flare tumbling across a cargo deck. The incident report was precise in the way that all incident reports are precise, factual, and bloodless, and completely inadequate to describe what actually happened. During a routine night training flight, Spooky 71 experienced a mechanical failure in the flare deployment system. A Mark 24 magnesium flare, armed and staged for release, broke free from its mounting rack due to vibration-induced fatigue in the retention bracket. The flare fell to the cargo deck and rolled. The cargo deck of a Spooky gunship during operations is not an empty floor. It is a landscape of ammunition containers, minigun feed belts, hydraulic lines, fuel vapor, electrical cabling. The flare rolled through this landscape like a lit match through a room full of gasoline. A Mark 24 burns at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If it detonates inside the aircraft, the magnesium ignites everything it touches. Ammunition cooks off. Hydraulic fluid becomes an accelerant. The aircraft becomes a coffin of fire falling from 3,000 feet with no survivors. Airman Jake Leverton had been standing near the aft gun position when the flare broke loose. He was 22 years old. He had taken shrapnel wounds earlier in the flight when a stress fracture in the airframe sent a rivet through the fuselage wall, peppering his torso and arms with metal fragments. He was bleeding from over a dozen small wounds. His vision was narrowing. The flight surgeon's later assessment was that he was operating on roughly 40% of his normal capacity. He saw the flare. It was rolling toward the primary ammunition storage. 3 seconds, maybe 4, before it reached the stacked containers. He did not call out, did not hesitate, did not calculate. He threw himself onto the flare, clamped his arms around it, and began dragging it toward the open cargo door. The magnesium casing was already reaching ignition temperature. It seared through his flight gloves in less than a second. Third-degree burns to both palms, all fingers, the insides of both forearms. The pain would have been beyond anything the medical literature has adequate language to describe. He did not let go. He hauled the flare 6 feet across the cargo deck, leaving a trail of scorched metal where the casing touched the floor, and heaved it through the open door into the darkness. It detonated 2 seconds later, a white flash in the night sky that lit up the Gulf Coast for a quarter mile. The aircraft landed safely. Every man aboard walked off under his own power, except Leverton, who was carried on a stretcher. Conscious, his ruined hands held upright by the medics to reduce swelling. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the very few enlisted airmen ever to receive it. The hospital room smelled like iodine and gauze and something chemical and sweet. The odor of debrided tissue of skin burned beyond recovery and cut away so that what remained might heal. Jake Leverton was awake. That was the worst part. He was awake and looking at her with eyes that held no accusation, no anger, no blame. He was 22 years old, and his hands were wrapped in bandages so thick they looked like white boxing gloves, and he was smiling. "Captain Mercer, they told me you'd come." She had rehearsed what she would say on the drive from Eglin. Professional words, gratitude for his courage, assurance that his sacrifice would be recognized. The kind of language that military protocol provides for moments when the truth is too large for ordinary speech. None of it came out. She sat in the metal chair beside his bed and looked at his hands at the bulk of those bandages and tried to reconcile what she saw with the engineering drawings still pinned to the corkboard in her office. Feed mechanism schematics, barrel rotation tolerances, ammunition belt specifications, clean lines on white paper, numbers that added up. They had not accounted for this. They talked about small things. His mother's farm in Virginia, the dog he'd left with his sister, the book he'd been reading before the flight, a Western novel he'd never finished because you cannot turn pages when your hands are wrapped in 4 inches of surgical cotton. She did not cry in front of him. She waited until she was in her car in the parking lot, engine of windows up the Florida heat pressing against the glass. Then she put her forehead against the steering wheel and wept in a way she had not wept since childhood. She had built the Dragon. The Dragon had saved the aircraft and its crew, but the Dragon had also put Jake Leverton in that bed with hands that might never fully close again. The weapon worked. The weapon was a triumph. And the cost of that triumph was a 22-year-old kid smiling at her from a hospital bed because he did not know how to be anything other than brave. Beckett had warned her. She had not listened. Now she understood. Not just the engineering, not just the ballistics, the weight, the human weight that every weapon carries in the hands of the people who serve it. But understanding the cost did not mean the work stopped. The opposite. The work accelerated because the M134 program was no longer experimental. It was operational, and operational meant that every flaw, every limitation, every tactical gap had to be identified and addressed before more people paid the price. And the flaws existed. The enemy, even a simulated one, is always adapting. In subsequent exercises, the OP-4 units, stung by their earlier failures, began developing countermeasures with the ingenuity of soldiers whose professional pride had been wounded. They pressed close, moved their positions to within meters of friendly force perimeters so close that the gunship could not engage without risking devastation to the very troops it was meant to protect. The pilot's banking turn requires absolute precision. The difference between rounds landing on the enemy and rounds landing on friendly soldiers is a matter of degrees in bank angle, a fraction of a knot in airspeed. A mistake measured in inches at the aircraft translates to a mistake measured in hundreds of yards on the ground. Friendly fire, the deepest fear. The one that woke Diane at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of her quarters, running geometry in her head. One navigation error, one misread grid coordinate, and the river of red traces that was supposed to be salvation becomes the instrument of slaughter against her own people. They dug deeper. Bunkers with overhead cover thick enough to absorb 7.62 NATO. The standard round was devastating in volume, but modest in individual penetration. A single round will not punch through 18 inches of packed earth and timber. 10,000 rounds will not either. The OP-4 discovered that sufficient depth and overhead cover could survive the Dragon's breath, allowing fighters to emerge and engage once it passed. They perfected discipline. No lights after dark, no noise, no muzzle flashes to betray positions. If the Dragon could not find you, it could not kill you. And at 3,000 feet in the dark over terrain offering 1,000 hiding places, finding the target was the hardest part of the job. The Dragon was not invincible. Diane documented each adaptation, each limitation, each tactical failure with the same precision she had applied to the original design. The weapon consumed ammunition at a rate that strained logistics. It depended on electrical power that could fail. It required maintenance in conditions of heat and vibration that degraded every component. Dust contaminated the feed systems. Corroded links choked the mechanism. A slightly kinked ammunition belt could silence the weapon as effectively as any enemy action. But it kept functioning, and it kept changing what was possible. The proof came on a Thursday afternoon when Captain Weston Cordell received a call that would define his life. Cordell was 28 years old, a Cobra gunship pilot with a quiet voice and a reputation for decisions that other pilots described as either brilliant or suicidal, depending on whether they worked. He was airborne in his AH-1 Cobra, returning from an unrelated mission when the transmission came through. A four-man reconnaissance patrol had been conducting a long-range exercise in rough terrain 60 miles from the nearest base. Their scenario had escalated beyond the planned parameters. The OP-4R element assigned to interdict them had performed exceptionally. The patrol was surrounded, pinned in a ravine with simulated casualties and no extraction helicopter available. The nearest transport was 40 minutes out. In the exercise rules of engagement, 40 minutes meant the patrol was considered lost. Cordell diverted without authorization. He arrived over the ravine and assessed the situation in seconds. The four men were clustered behind a rock outcropping. OP-4 positions ringed them from 3 directions. In a real engagement, they would be dead within minutes. Cordell attacked. He fired every rocket on his pylons into the OP-4 positions, walking the explosions across the ridgeline. Then he brought the minigun to bear, the chin-mounted M134 that gave the Cobra its teeth. and swept the flanks with sustained bursts that sent their POWs scrambling for cover. He expended every rocket, every minigun round, every piece of ordnance his aircraft carried. And the OP-4 kept closing because they knew the math as well as he did. Once the ammunition was gone, the Cobra was an expensive helicopter with 2 seats and no weapons. Cordell made a decision that violated every regulation in the Army Aviation Manual. He put the Cobra down in the ravine. An AH-1 Cobra is a 2-seat attack helicopter. There is no cargo bay, no troop compartment, no passenger capacity of any kind. There are 2 crew positions tandem under a narrow canopy, and outside of that canopy there are rocket pods, weapons, pylons, landing skids, and engine cowlings. He told the 4 men to grab whatever they could hold. 2 of them clung to the rocket pod mounting brackets. 1 wrapped his arms around the port landing skid. The 4th pressed himself against the fuselage behind the engine exhaust, holding a maintenance handhold that was never designed to support a human body in flight. Cordell pulled pitch and lifted out. The Cobra climbed out of the ravine with 4 men hanging from its exterior, their boots dangling in open air, their hands white-knuckled on metal that was never meant to carry them. The suppression Cordell had laid down with the minigun in the minutes before landing had bought them the seconds they needed to reach the aircraft. Without that volume of fire, without those hundreds of rounds per second, forcing every OP-4 soldier to abandon their firing positions and press their faces into the dirt, the 4 men would never have crossed the 30 meters of open ground between their cover and the helicopter. The minigun made it possible. Not the rockets alone, not the pilot's skill alone. The weapon that could fill a space with so much metal that moving through it was unthinkable. Cordell landed at the nearest airfield with 4 men still attached to his aircraft. All 4 walked away. The exercise referees did not know whether to reprimand him or recommend him for commendation. They recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork disappeared into the bureaucratic labyrinth of military awards processing. It was lost, refiled, mislabeled, buried under the accumulated weight of institutional inertia. Decades passed. Cordell left the service, raised a family, grew old. He did not talk about the ravine. Men who do such things rarely do. Diane Mercer did not forget. She tracked the paperwork. She wrote letters. She contacted congressional offices. She testified before review boards. She became in her retirement the persistent quiet voice that refused to let the story die. And after years that stretched into decades long after most people had stopped caring, the Medal of Honor was finally approved. Weston Cordell received it as an old man standing straight in a ceremony that most of the original witnesses were no longer alive to attend. Diane was there, standing in the back row, because she had never been comfortable in the front. But the dragon story did not end with medals and ceremonies. It continued in ways the public rarely saw, and in ways the public saw too much of. In 1987, a film called Predator reached theaters, and an actor shouldered an M134 minigun and fired it while standing upright. 2 years later, another film repeated the stunt. A myth was born. The handheld minigun. Physically impossible. The recoil force at 6,000 rounds per minute exceeds 150 pounds of continuous thrust. The weapon demands a power source the size of a car battery just to turn the motor. The film prop ran off a cable threaded down the actor's pant leg to a battery hidden off camera shooting blank cartridges at a fraction of the actual rate of fire. The ammunition alone, 1,000 rounds of 7.62 NATO, weighs between 60 and 70 pounds. A 10-second burst drains a load that most people could not lift off the ground. The minigun functions because it is vehicle-mounted. That is not a limitation. It is a fundamental truth of the weapon's design, and no amount of Hollywood mythology changes it, and it remains uniquely American. The Soviets never developed a counterpart. Their military doctrine favored artillery and simplicity. Weapons designed so that a conscript could maintain them in a frozen trench with numb fingers and no manual. The minigun is the opposite of that philosophy. Complex, power-dependent, and logistically ravenous, an engine that devours ammunition at a rate requiring an industrial supply chain to keep it fed. No field generators, no enormous mobile ammunition reserves, no heavy-lift helicopters to carry them. The Dragon was an American answer to an American problem, born from American engineering excess and sustained by American logistical capacity. Nobody else could feed it. Nobody else tried. The current model is the M134D titanium housing. Upgraded feed systems, improved reliability across every measurable parameter. You will find it on Black Hawks on special operations vehicles, on Navy riverine craft patrolling waterways, where speed and overwhelming firepower are the difference between coming home and not. The core design, 6 rotating barrels driven by an electric motor chambered in 7.62 NATO, is unchanged. 7 decades since Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling filed his patent. 6 decades since a 28-year-old woman stood in the Smithsonian and saw the future hiding inside a relic behind glass. Certain designs simply refuse to go away. On a cool evening in the early 2000s, Diane Mercer returned to Eglin Air Force Base. She was 81 years old. She walked with deliberate care, and her hearing was not what it had been, though she insisted that was age, not the years she had spent standing inside aircraft, while miniguns howled 6 feet from her head. Nobody who knew her believed that for a second. The base had changed. New buildings, new aircraft, new generations of soldiers who had never heard of the C-47, or the first Spooky, or the night when 63,000 rounds proved that a cargo plane could hold a perimeter against a regiment. But on the flight line, a Black Hawk helicopter sat with its doors open, and mounted in the doorframe was an M134D, titanium, where the original had been steel. Digital controls where the original had used analog switches. But the same 6 barrels, the same electric motor, the same fundamental principle that she had resurrected from a museum display case and a dead inventor's century-old patent. Callum Briggs had driven from Montana. He was 76 years old, thick through the shoulders. Still his hearing aided by devices in both ears, the quiet kid from the cattle ranch now. A quiet old man with hands that remembered the feel of a trigger assembly, the way a pianist's hands remember keys. They had not seen each other in over a decade. They stood together in front of the weapon, 2 old people in front of a machine that had defined their lives. The flight line was quiet. The sun was going down over the Gulf, painting the tarmac in shades of copper and rust. Callum did not talk about specifications. He did not mention cyclic rate or barrel lifespan or feed assemblies or any of the technical details that filled the manuals he had memorized half a century ago. He talked about the sound. "You never forget it," he said. 3 in the morning, pitch black, the base getting hit from 3 sides, and you're counting minutes until sunrise because that's all you can do. And then Spooky shows up. You hear it before you see it. That sound, that roar, and the tracers come down like a red curtain, and the whole world goes quiet. He paused. His eyes were somewhere else, somewhere 50 years behind him. Not because everyone's dead, because the ones who aren't dead are too scared to pull a trigger. Another pause, longer this time. And then the gun stops, and there's this moment, just a few seconds, where nothing happens. The desert just hangs there, still, and you're waiting. Everyone's waiting, because that silence never means it's over. He looked at her. It means they're still out there, holding their breath, praying to God the sound doesn't start again. Diane looked at the M134D mounted in the Black Hawk's doorframe. The titanium housing caught the last of the sunlight and held it warm and strange and beautiful in the way that only dangerous things can be beautiful. She had built this, not alone. Not without Beckett opening doors she could not have opened herself, not without Briggs' steady hands and Nash's flawless orbits, and Leviton's scarred palms and Cordell's breathtaking, reckless courage. But the spark had been hers, the moment in the museum, the refusal to hear the word no. The certainty, stubborn and absolute, that a dead man's invention could breathe again. The dragon had saved lives. She knew the number roughly. An estimate built from exercise reports and deployment records and the testimonies of men who had been on the ground when the red tracers came down and the enemy went silent. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, across decades of service on platforms and battlefields she had never seen. The dragon had also cost lives. She knew that number too, though it was smaller and harder to quantify. The men who operated it and went home with shattered hearing, permanent and irreversible. The crews who carried the weight of knowing what the weapon did to the human beings on the receiving end, even in training, even in simulation. And Jake Leverton's hands, which had healed but never fully closed again, which could hold a coffee cup but not button a shirt, which bore scars that mapped the exact contour of a Mark 24 magnesium flare casing. She had visited Jake every year for 3 decades until he passed quietly in his sleep in a VA hospital in Richmond. He never blamed her. He never even implied it. He would hold up his scarred hands and grin and say, "These got me out of doing dishes for life, Captain. I figure I came out ahead." And that absence of blame, that stubborn grace from a man whose body bore the permanent record of her invention's cost, was the heaviest thing she carried. Heavier than 63,000 rounds. Heavier than 3 rejections. Heavier than every technical specification she had ever committed to paper. The sun touched the horizon. The flight line went gold, then orange, then the deep purple that precedes full dark. Somewhere on the base, a helicopter engine spooled up. The familiar whine of turbines catching building, steadying into the rhythm that had been the pulse of American air power for 6 decades. Callum straightened beside her. Old habits. The sound of rotors still put steel in his spine. "You ever wonder," he said, "what Gatling would think if he could see what his gun became?" Diane considered the question. Richard Jordan Gatling, the Indiana doctor who had believed his terrible invention would end war by making it unthinkable. The man who thought the world would look at what he built and choose peace. "I think he'd recognize it," she said. "And I think he'd have the same question I do." "What question?" She watched a helicopter lift off the far end of the runway, its navigation lights blinking against the darkening sky, a Black Hawk, carrying an M134D into the night, the way Spooky had carried 3 of them over the desert half a century ago. "Whether we built it to protect people or to destroy them, and whether there's actually a difference." Callum Briggs did not answer. There was no answer. There never had been. They stood together on the flight line as the last light faded, and the stars came out over Eglin. And somewhere in the dark, a weapon born in 1862 and resurrected by a woman who refused to hear the word no waited in its mount with 6 barrels pointed at nothing. Patient and cold, ready to speak in a voice that sounded like the end of the world. And the silence held. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things once spoken echo long after the sound is gone. The dragon's roar was one of them. It had echoed across 6 decades, across test ranges and hospital rooms and award ceremonies and the quiet nightmares of men who had heard it and could not unhear it. It echoed still.